Hi guys, and welcome to our third lecture for Chapter 4. Today we'll be spending the majority of the lecture on something known as succession, what it is, how it's facilitated, and how it impacts ecosystems. And then toward the end of the lecture we'll be getting into invasive species, and then finally restoration. So random and discrete events, both whether they are natural events or man-made, can have huge impacts on ecosystems. And when we talk about these random discrete events, we normally refer to them as disturbance events. Disturbance events are events which have drastic impacts to environmental conditions, which result in changes to ecological communities. These disturbance events can be things like forest fires, they can be things like hurricanes, which we are all intimately familiar with, or they can be something like a volcanic eruption. So disturbance events are anything that can knock an ecosystem off balance. And remember how we talked about those positive and negative feedback loops and how a lot of ecosystems actually have built-in negative feedback loops to bring them back to equilibrium after they have been knocked off balance. Well, disturbance events are the events that usually knock an ecosystem off balance, and succession is the negative feedback loop that brings an ecosystem back to its equilibrium state. Succession refers to a series of predictable changes an ecosystem undergoes to return back to its former undisturbed state, i.e. its equilibrium state. Now, there are two major types of succession: primary succession, which essentially starts from scratch, and secondary succession, which is something that's far more common. But first, we're going to focus on the stages specifically associated with primary succession. Now, primary succession, again, is something that occurs when a disturbance event is so severe that no life is left in a given area. Think of this almost exclusively as a volcanic eruption. A volcanic eruption explodes and lava covers the entire ecosystem so that no animal or plant life are left in the area whatsoever. In this case, there are no organisms which can help immediately recolonize the area. And so primary succession occurs in three major stages. The first is called the colonization stage. In the colonization stage, organisms called pioneer species attempt to colonize the inert, barren rock or sediment that previously had nothing growing on it. And pioneer species are simply a name given to species who are first to colonize a previously disturbed location. And again, pioneer species only exist in primary succession. Secondary succession is something entirely different. We're going to go over that in just a second. After the pioneer species have begun to colonize the barren, unconsolidated sediment, then we go to the intermediate stage. And the intermediate stage is a series of transitional steps or stages between the colonization stage and the climax community. Basically, over the course of the intermediate stage, in a series of different steps, pioneer species are replaced with perennials, which are replaced with longer-lived species until we get to our mature forest. In the intermediate stage, we begin to see larger and larger plants and progressively larger animals begin to appear as we get to a more and more mature forest. Finally, we get to our climax community. In our climax community, vegetation from the intermediate stage is replaced with vegetation which resembles a mature forest. And so here we get to see very large trees, usually a very complex ecosystem with lots of animals, both large and small. And this is usually going to be the mature community, which remains in place all the way up until the next disturbance, which resets the system all over again. Now, in our other example of succession known as secondary succession, this is where succession occurs when a disturbance dramatically alters the ecosystem but doesn't outright destroy all life in an area. This is the form of succession which is far more common. An example of a secondary succession would be something like a severe fire, where most of the organisms have burned off and died, but as you can see in the example, there are a few organisms from the previous community or the previous ecosystem which are still alive and can help reset that system back to the former ecosystem with which it was. Basically, the old community remains in some small capacity in order to rebuild and bring that system back to its original climax community. So if there was a severe storm or a fire, that would be an example of a disturbance event which would lead to a secondary succession. Only in areas which are completely devoid of life, such as after a volcanic eruption, do you actually see primary successions that take place. And so, as you can see, the main difference between primary and secondary succession is that uncolonized, barren, or original habitat that was completely devoid of life is no longer there, and our pioneer species coming in and colonizing the habitat for other life to eventually replace it is also not there. In the secondary succession, we immediately start with our intermediate phase, that is some sort of damaged version of the original climax community, and gradually we would have larger and larger plants and larger animals replacing the smaller plants and animals until we get back up to our mature climax community. Again, this is what is far more common in terms of succession. Usually a disturbance event can be pretty severe, but it's very rarely severe enough to wipe out all life in a given area. Now, we like to think of succession as this linear model beginning from an uncolonized barren habitat all the way up to our climax community. And while that is largely the case for primary succession, secondary succession is far less linear. In reality, once colonized and brought to a mature climax community, ecosystems are constantly in a state of being disturbed and then healing, reaching the climax community, and then being disturbed all over again. So while primary succession is fairly linear, secondary succession and climax communities are constantly cycling back and forth. Very, very seldom do you encounter a mature climax community which hasn't been disturbed in the last 4 to 5 years, at least in some small way. So again, while primary succession is largely linear, secondary succession is kind of a constant ongoing battle between an ecosystem in equilibrium and what disturbance events are common in that area. Now, for the last few slides of this lecture, we're going to spend our time talking about invasive species and the problems that they pose into ecosystems that they are introduced into. Invasive species refer to non-native species which spread widely and become a huge problem in the ecosystems that they're introduced. Now, invasive species can either be introduced deliberately or, far more commonly, accidentally. Every once in a while, we'll try to introduce a non-native species into an environment as a way to control the environment in a way that we find favorable, but far more often, these species just kind of hitch a ride with us wherever we go. Maybe a plant or an animal kind of gets a ride as a stowaway, and then as a result gets introduced into an environment that is not familiar with that organism. This happens all the time, and it should be noted that around 95 to 99% of such invasions fail. More often than not, the ecosystem that an invasive species is introduced into is just too different from the ecosystem that that organism is actually from, and these differences cause that organism to just die because it can't survive in that environment. However, every once in a while, an organism will be introduced into an ecosystem that is favorable for it to grow and survive. And this is where we begin to have a really serious problem. Because this organism is not native to its new ecosystem, there are no biological controls to limit the growth of that invasive species population. There's no predation, there are no diseases in that area, and most of the competitors aren't familiar with how to compete with this organism. There is no resource partitioning, there is no niche partitioning, and as a result, this invasive species has no checks on its population. Because of this, that invasive species explodes in population growth, and this has major ecological effects. We've seen this with pigs, goats, and rats, which have destroyed island species that they were introduced into. And then other organisms, such as zebra mussels, are a great example of what happens when an aquatic invasive species takes over our rivers and our lakes. These can have huge ramifications for the ecosystems that these invasive species are invaded into, and in some cases, it can actually cause the ecosystem to collapse. A great example of an invasive species, particularly in Florida and the Gulf of Mexico, is the lionfish, that gnarly looking fish over here on the bottom left hand side of your screen. They're a great example of an invasive species, and they were introduced in around the 1980s or early 1990s, no one's quite sure when, via the aquarium trade. Someone took it and then released it into the wild. And because this organism was introduced into an environment which was similar to the environment that it evolved in, it was able to thrive in the Gulf of Mexico. However, there is no predator in the Gulf of Mexico that yet knows how to eat lionfish, and so this organism is growing at uncontrolled numbers. And you can see on the right hand side of your screen over here basically a map of how quickly that this organism is spread along the eastern seaboard, and now it's actually in Brazil as well as some of the interiors of the Gulf of Mexico. This is a huge problem because these organisms eat a lot of marine fish, and as a result it it is causing massive damage to the food webs in the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a huge problem, and we aren't 100% sure how to solve it yet. And it's one of the major challenges for marine scientists and marine biologists, is how to catch and kill these organisms in a way that we can actually control their numbers. And this brings us to looking at innovative ways for controlling invasive species. Now, there are a number of techniques to control invasive species, none of which are perfect and all of which have different ramifications, and I'll let you look over a few of them in your PowerPoint. Now, what you should know, though, is that controlling invasive species are very difficult and very expensive, and a lot of these methods can backfire and actually hurt native vegetation or native species far more than the invaders. This gives the invaders even more of an upper hand to cause even more damage. And so prevention rather than control is always the best policy. Trying to keep these organisms from getting into these new environments should be the major protocol and the major strategy for controlling the extent of invasive species and the damage that they can do into native ecosystems. Now, for the last slide, we're just going to take a minute and look at restoration and restoration ecology. It's no surprise that through invasive species, through different human-mitigated disasters, pollution, habitat loss, just a whole lot of things that we'll really dive into in Chapter 8, humans have dramatically changed the functioning of many ecological systems, most often for the worst. We have severely degraded systems to the point where many of them have ceased to function. And this is where restoration ecology comes in. Restoration ecology is a form of science which has the aim of restoring an area or an ecosystem to its former condition. The restoration of an ecosystem, and specifically their functioning role, some of those ecosystem services that they provide to humans, is the major goal when we are looking at restoration ecology. We try to get species back that have been removed from that area. We try to get the system functioning in a way that it can be self-sufficient and provide the ecosystem services that we as humans actually rely on. A great example locally is the restoration of the Everglades ecosystem. That's going to be that very productive ecosystem right in the southern tip of Florida. And originally this ecosystem received a huge amount of water from the northern part of the peninsula flowing down through the south. However, as humans changed the hydrology of Florida, we diverted a lot of this water away from the Everglades ecosystem into different canals. As a result, this ecosystem began to degrade very severely, and only in the last couple of decades have we begun to redivert water back into the Everglades ecosystem to try to bring this ecosystem back to its formerly productive state. Now, there is a lot of problems associated with restoration ecology. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes the ecosystem has been degraded to the point where it cannot come back. In other times, it's very difficult, it's very time consuming, and it can be very expensive to restore these ecosystems back to their former glory. So in practice, it's far better to keep them from being degraded in the first place, but in areas where we degrade these ecosystems, restoration science has come a long way, and we are beginning to sort of undo some of the damage that we've done. Now, this is everything that I have for you for this lecture. I hope you guys enjoy it, and then I'm looking forward to talking to you guys about biomes in the last lecture for Chapter 4 and Module 1. I'll see you guys then.